Hi, I'm Fraser Douglas, and I've been an avid tent camper for over 55 years. During these years, I've taken hundreds of camping trips, and one of the issues that keeps coming up before every trip is how to organize our camping equipment so that we can find whatever we need when we need it, without having to rummage through other stuff. And so I decided to look at the history of chuck wagons to see what lessons we can learn for modern family tent camping trips. Hope you enjoy it.
Back in the 1500s, ranchers in Mexico and South Texas began rounding up cattle and herding them to large cities where they could be sold for beef. But after the American Civil War in around 1865, cattle herding became a major economic activity. Ranchers in South Texas typically hired a crew of around 10 to 15 men and rounded up around 2,000 to 3,000 wild longhorn cattle that were roaming the countryside, and then drove these cattle about 700 miles from the San Antonio, Texas area up to some town in Kansas or Nebraska where they could be loaded onto rail cars and shipped to meat processing factories in Chicago. Since these cattle could only walk 10 to 15 miles a day without losing weight, the drive typically took around 2 to 3 months. So the cowboys camped out for 2 to 3 months during the trip, plus another month if they returned back to Texas together. The heart and soul of these cattle drives was its chuck wagon. It was a small farm or military wagon that was pulled by a team of 2 to 4 mules or oxen. The wagon box measured about 3 feet wide by 10 feet long, and it carried all of the camping shelters, bedrolls, clothing, personal items, tools, first aid supplies, water, food, and cooking implements needed by the 12 or so men for the next 3 to 4 months. Basically, it was a camping support vehicle for a 4-month-long camping trip. Most people know about the chuck box that was attached to the back of these wagons, but what is even more important to know about these wagons is the way that they were organized so that cowboys could find anything they needed whenever they needed it during the trip. The bottom of the wagon was filled with enough food to feed the 10 to 15 men 3 meals a day for several weeks. For example, they had to have at least 150 pounds of coffee beans because most cowboys wanted several cups of coffee every meal. In addition, they had to have plenty of flour, cornmeal, rice, molasses, brown sugar, bacon or salt pork, beans, potatoes, onions, dried fruit, and canned condensed milk. If they began to run low on any of these foods, they'd try to pick it up at one of the towns that they passed during the 3-month drive. On top of the food, they packed the bedrolls that each cowboy would need at the end of the day to set up his own camp. When these bedrolls were removed at the end of each day, the cook could get out all of the food that would be needed for the next 3 or 4 meals and put it in his chuck box. Wooden bow strips were bent across the top of the wagon so that a waterproof canvas could be stretched out on top of it to keep everything in the wagon dry in the event of rain. Around the sides, they attached a large 30 to 40 gallon water barrel, a couple of boxes to carry small tools, plus several larger tools such as axes and shovels that might be needed during the day. Under the wagon was a large animal skin that was stretched tight called a possum belly. This possum belly was kind of like a hammock, and it was used to hold firewood that would be collected during the day. The most distinctive feature of the chuck wagon was the chuck box, reportedly developed by Charles Goodnight, that was permanently attached to the back of the wagon. It was used to hold all of the food, spices, and utensils that would be needed to cook the next 3 or 4 meals. In addition, the chuck box also had some baking soda or saleratus, a small crock of sourdough starter, a crock of beans soaking for a future meal, a tin of lard, an alarm clock, and a lantern. The chuck box did not include fresh milk, eggs, cheese, or butter because refrigeration and ice were not available. Nor did it include a small gas stove that many campers pack today. The door of the chuck box had legs on it so that when it was opened it could be set up as a countertop workspace. This is where flour and sourdough starter were mixed with condensed milk and lard to make biscuits, where cornmeal was mixed to make cornbread and hoe cakes, and where meat and vegetables were cut up to make soups and stews. Beneath the chuck box was another large wooden box called a boot. It was used to store several Dutch ovens and other large pots and pans that would be needed to prepare the meals. So now let me describe how these chuck wagons were used to support these long cattle drive camping trips. Typically, the cook woke around 4 o'clock in the morning, started a fire, and then began preparing breakfast. A typical breakfast consisted of lots of coffee, bacon, biscuits, gravy, and perhaps some stewed fruit or rice with molasses. After breakfast, the cook would wash the dishes, repack the chuck box, and hitch up the team while the cowboys packed their bedrolls and loaded them back onto the wagon. After everything was loaded, the cook drove the wagon about 5 to 7 miles up the trail until he could find another good place to stop for lunch, and then he began preparing lunch while the cowboys slowly drove the cows to that spot. Lunch frequently consisted of leftover beans, biscuits, rice, cornbread, and anything else that could be quickly prepared. After lunch, the cook again quickly moved up the trail 5 to 7 miles until he could find a good spot to camp out for the night. Along the trail, the cook and the other cowboys would grab whatever firewood and buffalo chips they could find and pack them in the possum belly. After arriving at the final campsite for the day, the cook would start a fire, take care of his animals, and then begin preparing supper. Sometimes the cook would prepare a nice soup or stew made from game killed during the day or a cow that had difficulty keeping up with the herd, and sometimes the cook would prepare a nice pie or cobbler from the dried fruit. But frequently the cowboys just ate beans, onions, potatoes, and biscuits. After supper, the cook washed the dishes, packed the chuck box for the next few meals, pointed the wagon tongue toward the North Star, set his alarm clock, and tried to go to bed as early as possible so that he'd be ready to get up the next morning. Sometimes he might have to doctor an injured cowboy or repair some broken equipment or settle a dispute between two cowboys before going to bed.
So what lessons can we learn from this chuck wagon history that could make our family camping trips more efficient?
First of all, try to find a good camping support vehicle. For example, we found this 6-year-old Ford Expedition back in 2019, and it is large enough to carry all of the camping equipment that Ava, Lalo, and I need for an extended camping trip. But larger families may need to add a small utility trailer. Begin packing by packing the last things that you will need after setting up your camp in the center of your cargo area. For us, that would be our blankets, quilts, sleeping bags, pillows, and extra clothing. We'll pack other things on top of these items and thus be unable to get to them until after we've unloaded our car at our camp. Third, build the chuck box or make one from an old Army footlocker. In this chuck box, you should pack the food, spices, and utensils that you'll need to cook the next several meals. The chuck box allows you to get to your food and kitchen items even when other equipment is packed on top, and it gives you a nice flat table surface for preparing your meals. Leave the chuck box in the back of your car because campers in the eastern United States need to leave all of their food in their car at night to prevent animal scavenger problems, and unloading the chuck box every day and then reloading it at night would require unnecessary effort. Fourth, pack your food, kitchen items, stove, and fuel at the back of your car so you can get to it anytime you want to. Thus, you can stop anytime during your trip to eat lunch or a snack, and you can immediately make a fire and start cooking as soon as you arrive at your day's destination. Fifth, pack your tools, your first aid kit, a small table, and anything else that you might need during the trip or immediately after you arrive at your campsite in the back seat. Tie extra tables and folding chairs on top of your car. And finally, on travel days, try to eat your breakfast, clean up, pack your car, and get on the road as early as possible. If you get on the road by 8 a.m., you can usually drive 350 miles and reach your day's camping destination by mid-afternoon. Then you'll have plenty of time to set up camp, explore the area, cook supper, and take a bath, and still get to bed at an early hour.
Well, I hope that you've enjoyed this little history of chuck wagons, and I hope that you've learned something that you might be able to use to help you plan for your future family tent camping trip.
For more information about family camping equipment and packing procedures, please visit my website. A link is provided in the description below. Read my book titled Basic Tent Camping, and visit my Facebook page, Modern Tent Camping. Thanks for watching.